What's going on over here? Why is there something in the background? I don't know. Okay. So continuing the theme of our discussion last night a little bit, we're talking about the 15th of Av. Now the 15th of Av is probably the most mysterious, puzzling, and unknown Yom Tov in the Jewish calendar. And as we all know, the 15th of Av is mentioned in the Talmud together with Yom Kippur as the greatest. There were no greater holidays in the year like the 15th of Av. As we discussed last night, which we won't go into now, these are the days chosen by our sages, in both Yom Kippur and the 15th of Av. These are the days chosen by our sages for young men and women to meet for the purpose of finding their respective soulmates. So the Gemara says, well, we understand why Yom Kippur would be that day. Because it's a day of, I'm sorry, did I just let's get rid of this here. Okay. Yeah, that's better. So we understand why Yom Kippur would be that day, as we explained last night, because what better day to find your soulmate than the most soulful day of the year? A day of reconciliation, of reconnection, given that soulmates were once one in heaven and then separated, now find each other. And that's exactly the story of Yom Kippur. So that makes perfect sense. But the Gemara asks, what about the 15th of Av? And the Gemara gives a whole list of events that occurred recurrently on the 15th of Av that render it and classify it and make it the day chosen by our sages also for the day of soulmates, shidduchim. Before we go into the list of these events, we should point out the following. And that is that the 15th day of every month in the Jewish calendar is significant. And the reason it's significant is because the 15th day of the month is the day when the moon is in full alignment with the sun. If you look up at the moon, any day 15 of any Jewish month, this is not true of the Gregorian secular calendar. As you know, the secular calendar is a solar calendar, which means all it simply is, well, simply, it's not so simple, but what it basically is, it takes the rotation of the sun vis-a-vis the earth, or the earth vis-a-vis the sun, whichever your point of reference is. The Jewish view is that the sun goes around the earth, and it can be viewed either way. It's just a question of reference. At any rate, it takes 365 days for a total rotation. Divide that into almost, not exactly, but approximately. Divide it into 12, and hence you have your months. That's not the Jewish months. The Jewish months do follow the cycle of the moon. Every Jewish month begins with the moon's first appearance. It ends with the moon's disappearance. And the 15th day is the day when the moon is full, which means it's in alignment with the sun. Now, we all know that the moon represents the Jewish people in general, women in particular. As I mentioned last night, we are all fundamentally female. God is the husband, we are the bride. All human beings are born. The fetus is initially female. The male chromosomes don't emerge till some weeks after conception. So we are all the moon. And the woman embodies the Jewish people, the central identity of the Jewish people. Hence the idea of the moon and the cycle of the moon is verily a part of her physiological and spiritual makeup, the cycle of the month. So, all to say that the 15th day of the month means when the sun and the moon are aligned, that means when we are aligned with God, reflecting in every part of us the divine light, which is why the major joyous holidays take place on the 15th of the month. I'm referring, of course, to Sukkot and Pesach. The 15th of Av surpasses even the 15th of Nisan, which is Pesach, and the 15th of Tishrei, which begins the joyous holiday of Sukkot. And that's because the descent that we experience in the days prior to the 15th of Av, culminating in Tisha B'Av, is so deep and the estrangement is so painful that the reunion on the 15th of Av is immeasurably deeper than the reunion on the 15th day of any other month, even Nisan and Tishrei. Again, the reason? Because the distance is greater. The disalignment leading up to the 15th of Av is far more painful. The destruction of the temple and all of the tragedies that occurred on the 9th of Av, when in the weeks leading up to the 9th of Av, starting with the 17th of Taurus. So when it comes to the 15th of Av, this is a tremendous ascent, a tremendous reconciliation, a tremendously powerful unity and union, because it comes after such a powerful and painful descent and separation. So it's like Yom Kippur. In a sense, like Yom Kippur, because what's Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is reunion after sin. Sin is the greatest separation. So when there's reunion after betrayal, then that reunion is so much richer and so much deeper and so much truer. Similarly with the 15th of Av. So what were the events that occurred on the 15th of Av? Let's look at them and see how each one of them is in fact that which I just described, a reunion or a resolution to Tisha B'Av, which is about separation, exile, banishment, the house destroyed, the family members all gone, strayed, lost, in exile. So let's look at the events. What's the first happy event of the 15th of Av? The first event in history is that the dying in the desert stopped. What's the story of the dying in the desert? It all began on Tisha B'Av. You all know the story. The original theoretical game plan was that the Jews leave Egypt, which they did, receive the Torah, which they did, study it for a year, and then under Moses, go into Israel and live happily ever after. That would have been the Messianic era there and then. Wasn't meant to be. Moses doesn't go in, the people don't go in, and the people don't go in because of Tisha B'Av. Because Tisha B'Av was the day when the spies came back and said, we can't do this and we won't do it. As a result of that, the people cry and bemoan the fact that they'd even left Egypt to die at the hands of the Canaanites, in the end to perish. They meant this physically, spiritually, without going to that detail right now. The fact is that day was Tisha B'Av. So God says the immortal words that every Jewish mother has repeated ever since. You cry for nothing, I'll give you a reason to cry on this day. So we all know on Tisha B'Av, terrible tragedies occurred throughout history. But it was the 15th of Av in the desert. They were told that they would spend 40 years in the desert. This decree was leveled against all the men. It was only the men that protested, not the women. And in fact, it was only the men between the ages of 20 and 60, for they were of the draft age. So they all had to die. And they were the ages of 20 and 60, so God waited till they turned 60. That's why 40 years. So the 20-year-olds would turn 60. They only died when they turned 60. And they would die on Tisha B'Av every year. And it was a terrible event. They were told to make graves, and they all did. And the next morning, those that had turned 60 that year didn't get up. And so over the course of the 40 years, they all passed away. If you do the math, it's 600,000 between the ages of 20 and 60 over the 40 years. So it's 15,000 or so each year. So came the last year, the 40th year, and lo and behold, the last 15,000, dig their eternal rest, and get up in the morning, they're alive. What's going on? We must have made a mistake. Today's in Tisha B'Av. We erred in our calculation. Tonight must be Tisha B'Av. They did it again the next night, and again woke up to find themselves awake, alive. This went on till the 15th of Av. Now, when the 15th of Av came, the moon is full. There's no mistaking that we're beyond Tisha B'Av, and it's already. And then they realized the decree was over, and the last 15,000 were spared. As for God's decree, 40 years, they assumed 40 years from the incident of the spies. But God began the 40 years from the actual Exodus, some almost a year earlier. So the 20-year-olds that now were 60, they did go into the land. Point being that when did this all end? On the 15th of Av. So right there, a very obvious and dramatic end to Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, year 1, the decree began, and the 15th of Av, year 40, it was over. That's one event. The next event, much later in history, the day when the tribes of Israel were permitted to intermarry. What's the story? The story was, the law is, as originally given by God, is as follows. Any girl that inherits land, and she inherits land because there are no brothers, right? This is the story of the daughters of Tzlafchad, whose story you read recently, these 5 pious and wise young women who inherited land. So the law is that they could only marry someone from their tribe. Why? Because if they married someone out of their tribe, their children, whose tribal identity is determined by the father, would inherit land that originally belonged to their mother's tribe and now belongs to another tribe. So the Torah wants the allocations of the land of Israel that had been allotted to each of the 12 tribes to remain the possession of the 12 tribes. So that meant that a girl inherits land has to make sure that it remains in the tribal property. She must marry a male of that tribe. Not so terrible, but it's somewhat of a restriction of who she can marry. Now, the Torah itself indicates that this is not forever. It only means that first generation that goes into the land. It's up to the sages to decide when that law is no longer in force. To begin with, it was only temporary, because the Torah phrases it, when you go into the land, then you have to make sure in that first generation, meaning their children, that the land remains the possession of the originally allocated tribe, but thereafter, it is no longer a limitation. When should that law no longer apply was given to the hands of the court of the sages. And at a certain point in our history, they decided now is the time. And the day they convened the court and decided that no longer there will be a restriction on a girl who inherits land to whom she can marry, that day was the 15th of Av. On that same day, another decision was made. Without going into the long story, but there was a terrible story occurred in the early days. This is before there was a king, during the period of the judges, in the early days of the entry into the land of Israel. Without repeating the story, in fact, it's such a, you can look it up yourself, we've told it many times, but it's such a story that we don't publicly read it because of its the carnage and worse than that, the abuse and violation. So basically the story is that a Benjamite, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, who had gone to get his wife, she was a secondary wife that had left him. She had gone back to her father's house. He went back to woo her back. Okay, so she agreed to come back. And on the way back home, he passes through the tribe of Benjamin. He was an Ephraimite from the tribe of Ephraim, and he lodges there for the night. And a terrible thing happens. She is taken and abused terribly, and as a result of her treatment, she dies. The husband is outraged, and he informs in a very graphic way all of the leaders of the other tribes as to what some of the Benjamites had done. The leaders of the tribes gather and they say to the tribe of Benjamin, hand over these people for trial for rape and murder. The tribe of Benjamin says, this is an internal problem. We'll deal with it ourselves. The rest of the tribes give them an ultimatum. You surrender these suspects, or we go to war with you. The tribe of Benjamin refused to yield, and the rest of the tribes, 11 tribes, it's described at great length, the terrible battles, and the tribe of Benjamin is decimated. And moreover, the rest of the tribes decide to excommunicate them, the entire tribe. Intermarriage is forbidden between any member of the other 11 tribes and the tribe of Benjamin. And that's how things were. But the next generation, the new generation, following this tragic incident, that the whole nation was in turmoil, this national tragedy. So they, not continuing, remorseful and regretful and ashamed of what their parents had done, so the sages then decided to lift the ban. And they readmitted the tribe of Benjamin. It was the same day that they lifted the ban on who a girl could marry. And it was critical to do so then. Why? Because as a result of the wars, friends, many of the Benjamite men had been killed by the other tribes. And so there were many girls that were inheriting land. Their brothers had been killed. They are now the sole surviving member of a family. They inherit land. Now the old law was you got to marry someone from your tribe, but there was a severe shortage of young men because so many of them had died in these tragic battles. So the same day, the sages, when they readmitted the tribe of Benjamin, they said, now is the time to lift that original prohibition of keeping land only in the possession of a given tribe. The Benjamite girls can marry anyone from any tribe without limit. It was all on the same day. Now this, friends, if we probe deeper, is the opposite of Tisha B'Av. First and foremost, because Tisha B'Av, the original sin of Tisha B'Av was the people did not want to go into the land. And on this day, the land now becomes available to all Jews without limit. It's the opposite of restrictions on the land. It's opening up the land. Whereas the tribal boundaries were in place for several generations, now the entire land becomes embraced and can be settled and owned by any Jew. She can marry anybody, no matter what tribe, even though she inherited land from a given tribe. So it's the opposite of a limitation on the land, it's opening the land. Moreover, it's to be pointed out, I mentioned to you that the original sin of the spies was only the men. The women were never party to this. So here it's also the women are central to all of this, that they are now the ones through which the resolution, unity once again, the tribe of Benjamin is readmitted, the whole land now can be settled, owned by everybody. Who's at the core of all of that? It's the Jewish woman. And again, to go back to last night's class, how is this whole day celebrated? It's all in union, in marriage, and the young maidens dancing in the vineyards of Jerusalem. That was, friends, the first three events. Let's continue. Are you following all this, the history? And we're seeing how it's all the healing, the reconciliation, the antidote to the tragedies of Tisha B'Av. Now, years later, another tragedy ends. The story here, is as follows. We all know that the land of Israel, great tragedy again, division. It's all healing division. It's all dissolving boundaries. That's what the 15th of Av is doing consistently. Here's another illustration of that. So, after the death of King Solomon, who towards the end of his death had taxed the people rather heavily, and there was murmurings and complaints. When his son succeeded him, his name was Rehoboam, his response to the people's complaint was, "You think my father taxed you? You just wait to see what I will do." And that's what this foolish man did. And as a result of that, mutiny and rebellion, led by a man called Yerovam ben Nevat, and a breakaway. 10 tribes seceded from King Solomon's son's rule, forming the northern kingdom, called either the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of Ephraim, because it was dominated by the tribe of Ephraim. And the southern kingdom, called the kingdom of Judea, comprised by only 2 tribes, primarily Judah, the larger of the 2, and the tribe of Benjamin. This went on for centuries. There were 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom was eventually conquered, invaded by the Assyrians, disappeared, and they're referred to as the last 10 tribes. The southern kingdom, conquered by the Babylonians in the destruction of the first temple. We are all descendants of the southern kingdom, dominated by the tribe of Judah. That's what we call Jews. Jews is really only one tribe, but the tribe of Yehuda was the dominant southern tribe. Hence the name Yehudim, or Jews. At any rate, so this terrible division. Now the problem was this, friends, that the Jews of the northern kingdom still felt obviously profound allegiance, if not to King Solomon's son, but to the temple. The nerve center of the Jewish people, the heart of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's in the southern kingdom. So they would want to make a pilgrimage as prescribed in the Torah 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So what happened? So this Yerovam, who was the ruler of the breakaway kingdom, set up roadblocks, stopping Jews from his kingdom making the trek south to Jerusalem. And then he built another temple, an alternate temple in his capital of Shomron, Samaria. And that roadblock stood for centuries, for hundreds of years. And it was finally towards the end of the existence of the northern kingdom that the roadblocks were removed by King Yeshua ben Elah, who was in fact the last king of the northern kingdom. And so Jews now were free to travel in the north, to travel, not all did, but some did, and to reconnect to their heritage, their true heritage, Jerusalem. So the day that he removed it was the 15th of Av, and that's once again where there had been division, now union, reconciliation. Again, consistent with the tragedy of Tisha B'Av, which is about division and dispersal. The 15th of Av is about reunification. The final historic event is a very tragic one. The second temple destroyed.
Ask a question on this last one.
Yeah.
You said the roadblock blocked how much land, like where, what geographic area that people were, for centuries weren't able to get to, or only from one area?
It was one primary road. It was the only way you could get there. And there was this terrible roadblock, armed guards and what have you. There's no way to get across. I'm sure they had positioned, soldiers along any point, dividing north and south, but the main area where people would make their pilgrimage, that's where the formal block was. Yeah, you're right. Probably it was across the entire, cut the land into 2.
So for centuries, they couldn't make the pilgrimage?
No. I'm sure some managed to slip through, But overall, there was this division, this official division, that that most in the Northern Kingdom just didn't, just gave up, or had no desire to. In general, the Northern Kingdom was idolatrous, and the so-called temple that he built was pagan. It was as this assemblage of the holy temple.
But they were never cut off from the Jewish people. Like, they were still Jews.
They were still Jews. I mean, we could all be descendants of any of the northern tribes, because many in the north settled in the south before the roadblock, or maybe even afterwards. Like the Berlin Wall, some people made it through. So we are not necessarily members of the tribe of Judah, but they all settled in the territory of Judah. People that were loyal to King David immediately, saw what was happening and wanted no part of the northern kingdom and settled in the south. But eventually these roadblocks went up, not long after, and it became very difficult to make that decision. Terrible tragedy. 2 kingdoms. On occasion, even at war. Nothing drastic, but there was hostility. And for the most part, again, the northern kingdoms were dominated by weak, idolatrous, and corrupt kings. There were a few righteous ones. And the southern kingdom had also its fair share of corrupt leadership, but there were some righteous kings in the south, notably Chizkiah, that God wanted to make him Mashiach. And then there were others that did tshuva, initially were idolatrous. It's hard to understand the history then, the temptation of idolatry. Today, it seems infantile and juvenile, but idolatry then was sensuous and even ideologically very attractive and very powerful,
but
intoxicating.
Also just the way it was, so that the land and the people were so cut off until they were unified again for so long.
Yeah, that's the point. So the 15th of Av is once again the healing of a tremendous divide in the land and the people, which is what Tisha B'Av is all about. So now, the fifth event of the 15th of Av, it's the story of the fall of Beitar. We mentioned this last night briefly, but Beitar was the stronghold of Bar Kokhba, this great valiant Jewish general, this great leader who had 200,000 Jewish soldiers. Just to tell you, initially, in order to be admitted into his army, you had to show bravery. So what was his test of bravery? To cut off your finger and then just keep on, carry on. So the sage says, Bar Kokhba, could you find another way of testing the heroism, the bravery of your soldiers, other than maiming them? So he devised another means of testing them, and that was you had to be able to, at full gallop, uproot a tree and then throw it as a missile, as a javelin. But this is a huge, massive javelin. They were mighty warriors, and they were enjoying tremendous success against the Romans, vastly outnumbered. And it's so much so it seemed the Romans would abandon their occupation. And again, Rabbi Akiva thought this is Mashiach, and the Messianic year is about to dawn, the third temple, and happily ever after. But Bar Kokhba got carried away with his own victories, and arrogance seeped in, and that was the beginning of his downfall. What happened was, through an act of treachery, the Romans got into Beitar through an aqueduct, through underground the water system, caught the Jews of Beitar and Bar Kokhba by surprise and slaughtered all of them. It was terrible carnage. According to some, 2 million were killed, laid to the sword. The blood flowed and reddened the Mediterranean. This was such a great victory to the Romans because Bar Kokhba had become this mythical figure in his own life. His name was Shimon ben Kozibah. He's called Bar Kokhba because Kochav means a star, child of a star, because the prophecy in the Torah about Mashiach is a star will shoot forth from Jacob, and he was the star. His story is fascinating. It's written in detail. In the Talmud, and Josephus writes about him. It would make for an incredible movie. I don't know why. Maybe there has been a movie, but not recently, I would think. It would make for an incredible movie. Anyway, so they were all slain. And the Roman consul, gloating over his victory, refused to have them buried. It was 18 years they were out there in the Mediterranean sun surrounding his vineyard. He made them as a wall for his vineyard. And it was finally when he died, and it was the 15th of Av, the permission was granted by Rome to bury them. And that day was the 15th of Av. And they were buried. And there was two miracles. That the bodies didn't rot. During all of this time, they didn't decay. And that they were finally brought to burial. I mentioned last night, the final blessing, the fourth blessing that we say in grace after meals ever since, begins with the words, thanking God for his good and who does good, and it's to recall this event. Does good that they didn't decay. Good that they didn't decay. Does good that they were allowed burial. Quasi, celebration. But what we can see is that, again, it's a resolution to Tisha B'Av. The fall of Beital was like the final hammer blow to the destruction of the temple. It seemed that we might throw off the heavy yoke of Roman rule, and it all comes to a tragic end on Tisha B'Av. Beitar fell on Tisha B'Av, and its dead is finally brought to burial on the 15th of Av, years later. So again, it's the seeds or the resolution for the tragedy of Tisha B'Av. It's all consistent. What happens in the 15th of Av is all connected directly to the tragedy of Tisha B'Av, and it's the resolution, the end, the healing. And here's the final event recorded by the Talmud. Not an event, but the following. And this is our final teaching. It's very, very beautiful. The final event on the 15th of Av, the Talmud says, is the day the symbolic breaking of the axes. Yom Tovar Maigel. What's the breaking of the axes? So I don't want to be the bearer of sad news, but from the 15th of Av going forward, which is next week, next Monday, I think. The sun's rays begin to wane. Summer begins its gradual withdrawal. Therefore, the law is as follows. All of the wood that was used in the temple service for the sacrifices and so on had to be of the highest quality. It had to be dry, free of insects. So the law is that only wood harvested up until the 15th of Av was admissible. Any wood harvested beyond the 15th of Av, because the sun's rays, the days were shorter, this is where the wood was moister and would invite infestation. So the chopping, the harvesting of the wood ended in the 15th of Av. And to celebrate that, they would break the axes. Symbolically break the axe that was used to chop the wood, as if to say we're no longer required to use the axe because no wood is harvested going beyond the 15th of Av. So the Rebbe says, ask the obvious question, why break the axe? Just put it away for next year. Now this is a serious question, because in Judaism there is no wanton destruction, no wastefulness. It's a prohibition to waste anything. Everything in God's world has a purpose and should be used. So we don't break something if it can be used again. So why did they break it? So the Rebbe's answer is very profound. First of all, why would the fact, it's a nice thing that this is the day that they stopped, harvesting wood, but why would that give it? It's one of the designations that makes this day significant. This is the day they stopped chopping the wood. The other events are really significant. At the end of tragedy, why is it so important that this was the day that they ceased harvesting the wood? So let's answer that. The answer is, because what this means is the temple is complete. Tisha B'Av is the destruction of the temple. The fact that the storehouse of the temple is filled with wood for the rest of the year, this is like the completion of the Beis HaMikdash. Here it is, and its storehouses are full, and the service can now be observed without, with a full tank. So this is the profound significance. It's the opposite of Tisha B'Av. To make it even more significant, the Rambam defines the temple as a place where we bring offerings, where man brings offerings to God. Now, to bring offerings, you need what? You need the wood. So the fact that on this day the storehouse is full, and we're no longer going to seek wood because we have it, it's like the last brick to the temple. If the temple doesn't have wood, it's not a functioning temple, which is in the essence of what it is. Its definition, as the Rambam tells us, is a place to bring korbanos. So this is the subtle point over here. Why is it so significant? Tisha B'Av is the day the temple is destroyed. The 15th of Av is the day when it's full and complete. The storehouse is there. Clear? Yeah? But that doesn't answer why they broke the axe. I'm just explaining why this day is significant. Good. But why break the axe? Use it again next year in good health. So I want to explain part of it, why it's so significant that the wood harvesting is over. It's significant that it means the temple is full and ready and perfect, and we can now begin the service unimpeded. Why break the axes? The answer, friends, is the law is, in the building of the temple, the sound of iron may not be heard on the temple mount. The Torah says explicitly. All the stones are to be hewn off premises and then brought perfect and whole to the temple. That's how they built the first temple and the second temple. Why? The Torah says because iron is an instrument of war and shortens the life of man. It's inappropriate that its sound should be heard in the process of building that which lengthens the life of man and brings life. So don't bring iron. Amazingly, or not so amazingly, the third temple, which the prophet Daniel describes in very cryptic, mystical ways, which we haven't fully decoded yet. Only we all understand when Mashiach comes. There's indication there that the third temple has steel. Moreover, steel or iron wasn't even used as part of the temple. It's all brick. Gold, precious metals. But there was no steel or iron. But the third temple will be. The third temple will have metal, iron, steel. Why? Because the Mashiach will come. They will beat their swords into plowshares. That which had formerly shortened the life of man will now be the means for blessing. Evils transformed into good, darkness into light. So it's appropriate then that the temple should be made of iron. And that's why they broke the axe. It's symbolic of the axe breaking the axe, the metal axe is symbolic of, and a prayer and a hope and a wish that we will break the sword and turn it into a plowshare. That the instruments of war, the technology of war, will be the very instruments for life and to feed the whole population of the world and solve all of its ills. So the breaking of the axe is symbolic for a portent, you follow? For the breaking of the sword and its transformation into a plowshare. It's a prayer that we have the third temple when all negative forces are transmuted and transformed into positive forces. And that's why it's so significant. That's why they called it the day of the breaking of the axes. It was a prayer that we haven't finished the story yet. Even the second temple, the first temple, the most glorious time. We want the axes to be broken. We want the swords to be transformed into plowshares. And the final word which I've shared, the Hebrew word for iron is barzel. Barzel means iron. And Barzil stands for Bila, Rachel, Zilpa, and Leah. These are the 4 mothers of the 12 tribes. And what is it saying? That this power to not just defeat evil, that's a male thing. Male is to defeat, to conquer, to slay, which is only a temporary piece and an external one. But the feminine is to transform the enemy into an ally, to find the good, to nurture it, and effect inner transformation. So therefore, this whole messianic experience, which begins now on the eve of Mashiach's coming, it started already in many, many deep ways. It's begun. The transformation of the sword into a plowshare, that's a uniquely feminine contribution in the ultimate purpose of creation. And therefore the word Barzal hints to the mothers, not the founding mothers, but the ones, Dafka, the ones of the tribes. This is a lower level who have engaged the world and have had their ups and downs. The forefathers are all perfect, but the tribes went through all kinds of history. We just read now, the division of the tribes, north and southern, but the end, it's all going to be transformed. There'll be healing and unity and transformation. Hence, it's Bila and Rachel and Zilpa and Leah that are hinted to in this very transformative of the axe or the sword being transformed into the instrument of life, both physical and spiritual. I want to add something else at the end, so I was speaking. Saying that this is happening today. I'm just going to point out, we'll conclude with this. We're living through crazy times, unprecedented. We thought it couldn't get crazier, but it did. But if you look just probe beneath the surface, it's all incredible good that's struggling to assert itself, to blossom. So this whole idea of equality and everybody and justice and BLM, which is, I don't know if it's a front or it's being exploited, but terrible things are coming as a result. But nonetheless, and it's all pointing, it's the new anti-Semitism, and there's a thin veneer that separates the two. But nonetheless, that's all just the external stuff. Really what's driving it, and there is this consciousness. There is a general consciousness of oneness and unity and the dissolvement of barriers and boundaries. And we're all citizens of the world and healing the past. What's driving it all is all good. And for most people, it's coming from a good place. It's just here and there being siphoned and exploited. So we are in the throes of the axes, the sword being beaten into plowshares. And as you heard, it's the women that need to be at the forefront of this transformative birth, this rebirth of the world. May we merit the completion of the process in a painless way, an easy way, and without delay. A world reborn, renewed, a true home for Hashem and every one of his creations. And you can all unmute yourselves, friends, and comment.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Breaking of the axes, is there sources who initiated it? Did you say that? Did I miss that? How did it
No,
come
the Mishnah says it, like it goes back from day one. The Talmud brings it, Yom Tov Michael. So it may go back, I don't know. We don't get, not that I know, an exact date, but it could go back, I don't know.
Not so much the date, but was it one of those things initiated by the people? Where did it come from?
It's kind of, it's not clear. So it's from the people somehow. Whose idea was it, etc. We don't know, but someone suggested it. Maybe it was the wife of one of the Kohanim. Why don't you break the axe? You're not using it anymore. Break it so that it's the beginning. Who knows how that conversation began, but it just became the minhag.
Rabbi New?
Yes.
I know there's comparison a lot to women and pregnancy. This is not really related to but as we're talking, I just got a text from a Amanda.